All right, I'm going to review chapter 2 here. I'm going to pull out some of our slides over here on the left from our PowerPoints, or actually they're PDFs that are online for you to look at. Let's see here. So let's scroll up. I'm going to pull out this one. We'll look at this slide. And actually, this is kind of a cool one. We'll look at that one. Let's see what else is important to us. I think we're done with chemistry. I'm sure all of you will be happy if I don't review that. Let's scroll along here. Yeah, we don't need the chemistry. We need this. Review this. Good one. All right. So if you're going through and looking at the PowerPoint slides here, these are the ones that I consider important moving forward. Let me see here if any of these at the end. No, we'll do evolution later. All right. So I think that these are the only ones we need to look at. So I'll start here. Slide 3. We need to remember that carbon is important. The importance of carbon right here, because it allows us to make lots of different things. It can connect or bond to many different other elements, including carbon itself. It can bond to itself. And you make really complex molecules. And there are 4 particular molecules that are really important to life. And those are carbs, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. And in fact, all cells are made out of these 4 things. You store energy with carbs. You do work with proteins. All right, you make our membrane, which allows us to make the outer membrane and the organelles. You use lipids to do that. And you use nucleic acids to store information or transmit information. That's DNA and RNA, which we'll get to. You also need to remember that there are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. All right, I see a slide down here that's going to review that. So these are the main things that we need to get out of chapter 2, and they're the main things we need to remember moving forward. The main things that you might have forgotten, I'm going to review in this little video so that you can, kind of refresh your memory since it's been a few weeks. We're going to start up with like Grandma's Cookbook, which we were talking about as we left. But you might not remember some of the terms and things. So this is what this video is all about. Move this out of the way. Delete it. Interestingly, one of the slides in that chapter here is of a virus, and it just happens to be the exact virus type that COVID is. So we will come back to this at a later point, but this is, it's a coincidence, but this is a really good picture of it. This is exactly how it works, and I will use this later on. The macromolecules, of course, I mentioned are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. And we need to understand that carbs are, as I said, used for energy. Proteins are used for work. Lipids are used to make compartments or the outer membrane, which is to protect the inside from the outside, kind of a barrier. And nucleic acids store information for making the proteins, which make the lipids and then manipulate the carbohydrates. So nucleic acids are DNA and RNA, all right, and they store information for making the proteins. And then the proteins do work. They manipulate the lipids, form, put together the lipids to make membrane, and also process the carbohydrates for energy. The carbohydrates are broken down into ATP, which, if you remember, powers the proteins. The proteins do the work. The nucleic acids are the information or the instructions for making the proteins. The carbs can be broken down into ATP, which powers the proteins. And the lipids kind of protect everything. They create a barrier from within the cell to without the cell, or in the case of a eukaryotic cell, the little organelles. Okay, so very important. Those are kind of our review of all the information we covered the first couple of weeks, right there in 2 minutes. All right, let's do this one. All right, so we didn't talk about the fact that there are multiple types of lipids. There are fats, steroids, and phospholipids. Technically, the phospholipids are the ones that we were most concerned about. They make membranes. Fats can be used to store energy. That's why you get fat when you eat too much. And steroids, actually, these are lipids that are attached to proteins that form hormones. So hormones, we've talked briefly about them. Steroids are a type of hormone, or can be a type of hormone. But not all steroids are hormones. Not all hormones are steroids. But some of them that you might know are like testosterone. And they are usually a protein and a lipid that are attached to one another, at least if they're a hormone. Not always. All right, just a little trivia there that we haven't talked about. In this slide, we talk about bonds. Of course, things stick together by bonding. They share electrons. We sort of talked about that. That's more in your chemistry class. But most things are made out of carbon. That's why when you go to other planets, they look for carbon. So those 4 macromolecules we talked about are all carbon-based. And so carbon is very important. Of course, we use oxygen a lot. And then, of course, the hydrogen is important. That's how we separated the hydrogen into protons and electrons to form essentially electricity to power ATP synthase and recycle our ATP, if you remember that one. All right. Nitrogen is not as important as the other three, but it actually is important because you're going to use it in making DNA. Amino acids, we haven't talked a lot about, but we will in the near future. There are going to be 20 of them, and really they call it a peptide bond. It's really just a covalent bond like we've talked about before. All right. And remember, they fold up. You put together individual amino acids, all right? And then once you put a whole bunch of them together, all right, and as a long string, they fold up. And that's what they're showing here, is that they fold up. All right. And we looked at this one. Okay, let's take a look at this one. This is just talking about sugars. In this particular case, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. Realize that glucose is the thing that we can turn into ATP when we eat it. But if we're not using all of it, we can stick all of the glucoses together and make saccharides, sugars. So glucose is a simple sugar. You stick a bunch of simple sugars and bind them together like this, and you end up with carbohydrates, large complex carbohydrates like starches. Okay, not much there. We didn't talk much about that. Okay, another biological macromolecule, of course, is DNA, nucleic acids. And we have two types, DNA and RNA. RNA is single-stranded usually. DNA is double-stranded. Slightly different structures. Up here you have, in RNA, you use a T, thymine. I'm sorry, up here you use a U, that's uracil, and you replace it with a T. Those are, the four letters are A, G, C, T for DNA. And for RNA, you replace that T with a U. So RNA is a little different. It's also single-stranded. DNA over here is double-stranded. And remember that the A's bind to the T's and the G's bind to the C's. Those are things you should have learned. Well, I teach them, very young. I've taught junior high school before, and we learned all of that. I don't know if you guys were lucky enough to learn it that young. Usually don't forget it if you learn it in middle school. All right, let's move on. We're going, just realize that RNA often, it can be double-stranded. It's not double-stranded in us, but in some viruses, they have double-stranded RNA, and your body sees that as a danger sign and will try to destroy it. So we don't have double-stranded RNA, and if it appears in our cells, we try to destroy it immediately. All right. Here's another DNA top. Again, talking about the AGCTs. This is with DNA only, not RNA. Down here, A binds to T and G binds to C. The difference between DNA and RNA is that you replace this little T here with a U, and that makes it RNA. The DNA will often be double-stranded. The RNA, at least if it's natural, as in coming from our bodies, is going to be single-stranded. Okay, so you're not going to get double-stranded RNA unless you're a virus. All right. All right, almost done here, kind of reviewing with this one. Here we get back to our prokaryote versus eukaryote. Remember that the prokaryote is very simple, just has some DNA in here and a membrane around it. Don't forget those ribosomes in there, cytoplasm, but very simple. This is our apartment mansion story, so don't forget that one. Let's see here. And here are some more things to remember. Remember that the little bacteria are small, microscopic. They have no nucleus and no organelles. And we didn't talk about the fact they have a more complex cell wall, but they do. In us, eukaryotes, we're much larger. Could be 10,000 times the size of a bacteria. Complex. We have organelles and all kinds of chemistry and much more DNA. That DNA, the genetic material here, that's what they're referencing, is in the nucleus. In other words, it's in its own compartment made out of membrane, lipid. And we have organelles like mitochondria and lysosomes and all of those that we talked about. And some eukaryotes have cell walls. Plants have cell walls. We do not. All right, and that is it. I will make some more videos about using this app and some other apps, but I'll be going through the PowerPoints this way. This should be a better way to do the PowerPoints and give you a lecture. We'll also be doing, I've learned to make animations, so there will also be some animations in all of this.